Welcome to this episode of the Viking Virtual Resident Historian. It's part of our ongoing cultural enrichment program and our commitment to destination-focused learning. A series that takes you further with unique perspectives and intriguing insights. It analyzes and puts into context important chapters of world history. The Viking Virtual Resident Historian puts history at your fingertips. We hope you'll find this episode enriching.
Hello, I'm Paul Dawson, and this is part 2 of the history of France. Here's a reminder of our entire roadmap. In part 1, we covered France's early history, the medieval period, the excesses of Louis XIV, and we finished with the Revolution in 1789. In part 2, we pick up the thread in the 19th century with the age of Napoleon. Then we will move on to the 20th century and France's modern age. Just as a quick refresher, here's how we left the story in part 1. It was October the 16th, 1793, and we are on the Place de la Révolution in Paris. Queen Marie Antoinette, or prisoner number 280, as she was known, had just been executed by guillotine. Her execution followed that of her husband, Louis XVI, himself brought to the guillotine in January 1793. And with these two acts, France's monarchy had been brought to an abrupt end. But the country was still in turmoil. And while all this was happening on the streets of Paris, a young officer from Corsica was working his way up the ranks of France's 1st Artillery Regiment. He was about to burst on the scene and to permanently change France's landscape. That young Corsican's name was Napoleon Bonaparte. His rise up the ranks had been meteoric, and he was soon conquering the Italian peninsula and becoming a French war hero. His ambitions seemed boundless, and they were realized on December the 2nd, 1804, when this simple Corsican man was crowned Emperor of the French. And just in case his people had any doubts, here he is depicted as emperor in his coronation costume. This was painted in 1806 by the somewhat adulatory painter Ingres. The painting gives us some not-so-subtle hints about Napoleon's greatness. For one thing, in his hand, he's holding a scepter belonging to the Holy Roman Emperor Charlemagne. And for another, that's Roman Emperor Caesar's laurel wreath on his forehead. This leader of all leaders was soon waging war against his neighbors and winning most of the battles. Our map of European powers in 1812 shows just how far he got. Napoleon's empire is shown here in light purple, and you can see it stretches across the continent. Napoleon had annexed or directly controlled territories with some 70 million subjects. But he had enemies everywhere, and it was in Russia that he finally met his match. He'd invaded with his Grande Armée in June 1812, but crucially, he hadn't thought about the oncoming Russian winter. He even declared confidently to his generals that, "I have come once and for all to finish off these barbarians of the north." Surprisingly, no one came to greet his army in Moscow, and while he waited for the Russians to sue for peace, that harsh winter came early and began to grip the country. Too late, he ordered his troops to withdraw, but thousands died on the frozen route home. By late November 1812, it was every man for himself, and the Grande Armée was annihilated. Russia was the turning point in Napoleon's fortunes. Undeterred by this failure, he did manage to raise another army, but once again he was defeated, this time in Leipzig in 1813. He was exiled to the island of Elba, and That should have been that. But he sneaked past his guards on the island, and in March 1815 he returned in triumph to Paris. In the 100 chaotic days that followed, he mobilized yet another army for the last time, and his luck finally ran out on June the 18th, 1815, when his army suffered a crushing defeat at Waterloo. With that, the French monarchy was restored, and Napoleon was exiled again, but this time to the middle of the South Atlantic and to the island of St. Helena. He didn't escape again. Napoleon I's dreams of empire were over. Or were they? You'd think that with Napoleon's definitive removal from France, the Bonaparte name would be finished. But not so. Let me set the scene for the Franco-Prussian War that will commence in 1870. We'll start with the Revolution of 1848, and it was here that Napoleon I's nephew was swept to power as President of the Republic. He was known as Napoleon III, and he set about restoring France's prestige. At home, he had Baron Haussmann redesign Paris with the wide boulevards that we know today. And abroad, his foreign policy at first seemed benign. But he couldn't resist getting involved in foreign conflicts. He'd been worried for some time about the threat posed by Prussia. And on July the 19th, 1870, he was goaded into action by a provocative telegram from Prussia's Otto von Bismarck. Napoleon III declared war, confident that a superior French military would prevail. But in reality, the French, who are shown here getting ready for war in a painting by Pierre-Georges Janiot, were beset by delays and inefficiencies. The Prussians were much better prepared, better equipped with the newest artillery, and far more savvy in using a new mode of transportation, the railway. Ultimately, it was the Prussians' superior war machine that rapidly outmaneuvered the French. At the Battle of Sedan in September 1870, the Prussians not only encircled the French, but they actually captured the French leader. The French were in total disarray, and Napoleon III was deposed in absentia 2 days later. Bismarck soon had his troops massed outside Paris, where they laid siege to the city for 4 months until it surrendered in January 1871. Bismarck had triumphed, and as for France, that once supremely confident European power, her humiliation was complete. The Franco-Prussian War was short-lived. It only lasted about 6 months, but it had far-reaching consequences for all of Europe. France's Alsace-Lorraine region was annexed by the Germans, as seen here on this map, and that region's contested borders kept the two nations on the edge of conflict. The seeds had been sown for 20th century war. The end of the Franco-Prussian War and the redrawing of borders had brought a shift in Europe's balance of power. But the end of hostilities coincided with the final decades of the century. This released a wave of fin de siècle optimism and prosperity, La Belle Époque, or the Beautiful Age. The arts flourished, especially in Paris, and this is considered a golden age. It was a time when artists like Renoir gave us joyful works like the sun-dappled Moulin de la Galette on our screen. It was also the time of the Universal Exposition in Paris, when French engineering marvels like the Eiffel Tower competed for the world's attention. But the optimism was short-lived. The Belle Époque turned out to be only a brief interlude of peace before France was returned to the horrors of war. The 19th century had been a time of enormous upheaval for France. She'd entered that century under Napoleon as a seemingly invincible European power. But by the end of the century, the humiliation of defeat by the Prussians had left France a very different place. Yes, the Belle Époque did bring a brief interlude of respite, and we will see that continue at the start of the new century, but there were storm clouds on the horizon. Indeed, the turn of the century did see a continuation, albeit short-lived, of Belle Époque optimism. In the first decade of the new century, Paris had become a mecca for artists from around the world. One location in particular, in the Bohemian district of Montmartre, had become a sort of hub, bringing together artists both established and aspiring, and that was the Bateau Lavoir. It was a grubby and unassuming former piano factory whose name translates into English as the wash house boat. This poorly heated and ramshackle building was home to a diverse group of artists who called themselves the Band of Maniacs, and its dingy rooms became their unofficial club. Pablo Picasso, Gertrude Stein, Guillaume Apollinaire and Jean Cocteau, who we see on our screen, were just four of many artists, authors, poets and playwrights who gathered in the Bateau Lavoir. Picasso, in particular, was a regular, and in 1907 he painted his famous Demoiselles d'Avignon, the young ladies of Avignon, under its roof. This was the beginning of a new century. This was the start of something new. This was a new wave of artistic energy driven by penniless but optimistic idealists. And as these artists created their new forms of art, they were completely unaware of the carnage that was waiting round the corner. That carnage was unprecedented. Unprecedented in that this was the first war of the new machine age, the first war using tanks, machine guns, and airplanes for military maneuvers. Unprecedented also in that it took the lives of an estimated 9 to 10 million soldiers, and the same again for civilians. Its main theatre was the Western Front, illustrated in the map on the right. And along this meandering line, both sides were dug in. The line itself changed little over the years, despite offensives that inflicted huge casualties. Among the most costly were the battles fought at Verdun and the Somme in 1916. We may remember the first day of the Battle of the Somme, July the 1st, 1916, as the bloodiest day in the history of the British Army, with over 19,000 dead. But for the French, their infamous day is August the 22nd, 1914, when more French soldiers would die in a single day than in any other war. In less than 24 hours, during this less well-known Battle of the Frontiers, 27,000 French soldiers lost their lives. The painting is by C.R.W. Nevinson, who served as an ambulance driver in Belgium on the Western Front. It's called La Mitrailleuse, or the machine gun, and it captures the horror of this new mechanized slaughter. This great war was supposed to be the war to end all wars, yet the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, hammered out in 1919, only placated some while infuriating others as the 1920s unfolded. How quickly we seem to forget and move on from tragedy. After the horrors of the First World War, freedom and peace could not come fast enough to Europe. Paris, like other European capitals, breathed a huge sigh of relief. And it was here that the world of fashion took off in the years immediately after the war. Aspiring designers flocked to work in the atelier of the likes of Lanvin, Patou, and Chanel. Gabrielle Coco Chanel, shown here on the left, seemed to capture the post-war zeitgeist best with her revolutionary, simple designs. Indeed, she's credited with creating one of the earliest examples of the little black dress, or the LBD, as it's called, shown here in one of her own sketches. Wealthy foreign women flocked to Paris for haute couture. Here we see them parading in the latest fashions in the 1927 painting entitled Americans in Paris. It's by the American artist Guy Pen Dubois. He, like many Americans in the years after the war, was drawn to Paris, and he captured the culture and society around him, the cafes, the theatres, and the flappers of the 1920s. But, like the Belle Époque before, the 1920s turned out to be just a fleeting period of calm. Storm clouds were gathering once again. War returned, and once again, France came under attack. The defeat of France's powerful army in a mere 6 weeks by the Nazi Germans in 1940 still stands as one of the most remarkable military campaigns in history. German troops entered the French capital on June the 14th of that year, and 6 days later, France surrendered. In a sinister twist of irony, Hitler insisted on signing the capitulation document in the same railway carriage that had been used in 1918 for Germany's surrender. Soon, France was humiliated again, this time by the sight of Hitler strolling in front of the Eiffel Tower. Up until 1942, the Germans occupied northern and western France, shown here on this map in red. South of this, the Free Zone, shown here in purple, was administered from Vichy by Marshal Philippe Pétain. But in November 1942, responding to the Allied landings in North Africa, the Germans and the Italians invaded the Free Zone too. The whole of France came under German military control. Resistance groups formed, but when they were caught, there were savage reprisals on the civilian population. General Charles de Gaulle was the leader of that resistance. Let's spend a moment to appreciate the man. He was born in 1890, became a decorated officer in the First World War, and continued to serve in the army during the interwar period. He was forced to flee to London in 1940 after a failed counterattack against the Nazi invasion. And from there, he led the Free French Forces and organized much of the resistance effort, appealing to the French to continue resistance against the Nazis. In 1945, he would return to France to a hero's welcome. He subsequently became president of the provisional government and wrote the constitution for the new Fourth Republic. And thereafter, as these images illustrate, he remained a fixture in France, indeed in the world, until his death in 1970. De Gaulle saw France through periods of rapid economic growth and great instability, including the Algerian crisis of 1958. He ended that war in Algeria and began granting independence to France's colonies. Later, he restored Franco-German relations, which he saw as an important counterweight to Anglo-American influence. His last presidential term began in 1965, and it was arguably his most turbulent. Having survived the mass student and worker protests of 1968, he lost a referendum, resigned in 1969, and died a year later at the age of 79. Let's revisit the period immediately following the Second World War that brought special problems for de Gaulle as he sought to untangle France's complex colonial mess. In France's Indochina colonies, conflict had begun in the 1940s. It only ended when France, over the objections of the US, agreed that the Viet Minh could control Vietnam above the 17th parallel. This was a decision that laid the foundations for America's later war in Vietnam. Algerian nationalists, encouraged by France's 1954 defeat at Dien Bien Phu, began hostilities in a war that lasted until 1962. In the minds of many French people, these two conflicts are deeply intertwined, and they remain a source of controversy to this day. So it took until 1962 for France and her former colonies to put these difficult adversarial relationships behind them. The Second World War had brought France to her knees. Infrastructure had been largely destroyed. The task of rebuilding was extraordinarily difficult. But France's rebound from this low point is a post-war success story. From a period when the population was demoralized and poorly fed, France emerged into a new era of prosperity, self-confidence, and optimism, a period that the French know as les 30 Glorieuses, the 30 glorious years. It was an unbroken period of economic prosperity, and it lasted until the 1970s, when it was upended by the oil crisis. Seen here on the left, an admittedly sexist advertisement for Moulinex in the 1960s. It shows how labor-saving devices for her will produce nice food for him. The message for the iconic Renault 2CV on the right needs no explanation. It simply says, "La vie est belle," life is good. These were positive times for a nation that had been through hell. Indeed, many French people today look back with nostalgia on this special era of growth and optimism. Let's go back to the beginning of the 30 Glorieuses, and in particular to the year 1957. This was a momentous year for France and for Europe, when the Treaty of Rome was signed into existence by 6 European countries. The new European Economic Community, or EEC for short, was the forerunner of today's European Union. Among its ambitious goals, it set out to eliminate trade barriers, to develop common fiscal and social policies, and to allow the free movement of goods and people across borders. Membership grew from the original 6 countries to 28, with Croatia becoming its 28th member state in 2013. Britain's momentous Brexit decision reduces this to 27, but a number of applications are pending that could soon see the membership rise once more. There's no question that those early EEC members had big dreams for Europe. We should remember that what began around that table in 1957 was a commitment never to allow a return to the wars that had twice torn the continent apart. These early members would be amazed to see the economic success of the European project today. From its small beginnings, the EU has grown to become the world's largest trading bloc. It has a population of more than 500 million and a combined GDP just shy of that of the US. And France's role has been integral from the start as a founder member and key player of today's EU. And so from yesterday to today, France is deeply proud of her history, her heritage, and her place in the world. And in that heritage, we haven't even mentioned gastronomy. France considers herself to be the home of great gastronomy, and she has a history that encompasses the 14th century recipes of the royal chef Taillevent right through to today's modern celebrity chefs such as Joël Robuchon and Paul Bocuse. France has combined that leading role in gastronomy with a wine industry that is the envy of the world. And France also vies with Italy in claiming to be the home of luxury. Its companies dominate a global industry estimated to have reached $1.2 trillion in 2017. Finally, With more Nobel Prizes in literature than any other country, France's contribution to the arts is unquestioned. In music, Edith Piaf's songs, for instance, have reached the four corners of the world, making her France's best-known singer. France is looking forward, too. From supersonic passenger planes to super-fast TGV trains, France has led the world in speed. Looking back, France has made great contributions to art, culture, and science over the centuries. And in looking forward, France is building a society for the 21st century based on its strong values of liberté, égalité, and fraternité. All that is left to say is Vive la France! Thank you. Hello, and welcome to this edition of the Viking Resident Historian Program. My name is Paul Dawson, and I'm coming to you once again from Winchester in the southern United Kingdom. Now, for those of you who didn't join us 2 weeks ago, we reviewed France's early history in the first part of the lecture. And I promised at the end of that lecture that I would answer several questions that I didn't have time for last week. So before we get into the questions which have been coming in while the lecture has been going on, I'd like, if you don't mind, to answer the questions from last week. The first one I'd like to answer is from Joni Main in DeBarry, Florida. And she asked, was the guillotine used outside France? And I'd like to thank Barbara Titus from Philadelphia and Char Wales from Great Falls, because both of those guests chimed in last week to tell us that, yes, indeed, the guillotine was used outside of France, and in fact was used mostly in French-speaking protectorates and places like Vietnam and the French Caribbean. The last use of the guillotine was in Paris in the 1970s, after which capital punishment was banned in France. But while I was researching this for Joni, I came up with some interesting elements of the story of the guillotine, and I wanted to share them with you. Joni, I wonder if you knew that there was an antique working order guillotine that appeared on sale in Drouot, which is a very fancy auction house in Paris, in about 2011. And the fun fact here is that, of all people, Lady Gaga put in a bid to try and win this guillotine, which she didn't, and it went to a Russian collector. But the French state jumped in and said that this was a piece of French heritage and couldn't leave the country. So it had to stay in France. And bizarrely, it ended up in a nightclub in Paris for 8 years as hopefully as a non-working prop. But in the end was then sold again by auction in 2018. So an interesting side story to the history of the guillotine. And thank you for that question, Joni. The next question was from Sherry Irvine in Passaic, New Jersey. And she said that we've got an extra day in Paris, any suggestions? And I asked her to think about that, because what I wanted to do was to make sure that I could find things for you to do outside Paris that you wouldn't normally get to do on a Viking cruise. And so I've looked online, and there were 3 suggestions I've got for you. I'm only going to tell you about one now, but I'll put all 3 on the reading list, which will be available tomorrow. But the one I wanted to talk to you about is Chartres. It's an hour, more or less, on a fast TGV out of Gare Montparnasse in Paris. You have to make sure you're on the fast train, because otherwise it's 2 hours to do the same trip. But when you get off this train, you arrive in this marvelous small city of Chartres with the cathedral, which is this high Gothic expression of art in stone. It's absolutely beautiful, and it's seen to be France's most romantic cathedral. But it's when you get inside the cathedral that your breath is taken away, because it has 160 something stained glass windows, medieval stained glass, beautiful stained glass. And one of life's great experiences is to watch the sun coming through one of those windows and playing on a stone floor in Chartres Cathedral. So you'd have time to get there and back easily in a day, enjoy Chartres Cathedral and the old town around the cathedral, and be back in time for dinner in Paris. A couple of other suggestions which you'll find online, also using France's fantastic TGV system, which gets you out into the provinces in very quick time indeed. So Sherry, thank you very much for that question. And now I'd like to ask, this is a new question which two people asked last week. Susan Stetter from Bandon and Kelly Mavournin from Fitchburg. Both of them asked, what's the story with Marie Antoinette's children? And I've got some notes here. First of all, she was a devoted mother to 4 children, the first of which died very young, under the age of 1. It was a premature birth, and the child never made it really out of the first year of life. The second child, whose name was Louis Joseph, died at the age of 7 of tuberculosis, a common scourge in those times. But 2 children out of 4 survived, and they survived Marie Antoinette's execution in 1793, and they were imprisoned. One of the children then died, that's Louis Charles, died in prison of tuberculosis again, although probably some mistreatment too in prison 2 years after his mother's death in 1795. But the interesting one is Marie-Thérèse, who was released from prison and left to go to Vienna to live with her mother's family, and lived to the ripe old age of 72. So 4 children, one of whom survived into adulthood for Marie Antoinette. So thank you to Susan and Kelly for that question from last week. And one last question here is from Kathy in Durango, Colorado, I guess. And she asks, why do the French always seem to be on strike? Well, Kathy, I wanted to think about that, as I said to you last week, and I'm asking again if I can leave that to the end of my presentation tonight, because I think that there's some very interesting insights into France's psyche when it comes to strike action today. So those are the questions from last week. Now let's look at what's been coming in online. And the first one is from Jeffrey Davis in New Haven, Connecticut, and he asks, what happened to Napoleon II? Yes, there's a Napoleon I, we know, and Napoleon III. We've just covered both of those in the lecture, but there was, for a very brief time, a Napoleon II. He was the son of Napoleon's second wife, who came from Austria. And he was called Francois, and he lived in France. And at the age of 3, when his father was deposed, Napoleon tried to put him on the throne, but the French were having none of it, and he was soon removed, and the French monarchy returned, and little Francois went off to his mother's family in Vienna again, like Marie-Thérèse before, where he lived until the age of 21, using the name France, not Francois anymore, but France in Vienna. And he died again of tuberculosis at the age of 21. So a brief interlude of Napoleon II, sandwiched between his father, and his cousin, Napoleon's nephew, who was Napoleon III. So that's Jeffrey. Thank you very much for that question, Jeffrey. Let's see. Here's another question about Napoleon, and it's from Cynthia Black in New York, and she asks, was Napoleon a hero or a tyrant? Well, I think to answer that question, we need to divide Napoleon's life into two and look at his military career on one side and then his civil achievements on the other. And let's take the military to start with. I mean, no question, astonishing trajectory from a young Corsican soldier who came of age during those tumultuous years after the French Revolution and then shot up the ranks of the military. He was commanding armies in his 20s. He was beating enemies all around France in his 30s. And by the age of 35, he was crowned Emperor Napoleon of France, the first such emperor since Charlemagne, 1,000 years before. So an astonishing trajectory. But what comes up must come down, and Napoleon then spent 10 years after that zenith, if you like, losing a lot of battles, culminating, of course, in Waterloo. But I think that the legacy of Napoleon the soldier is that of a brilliant strategist. He is said to have told his men that his presence on the battlefield was worth an additional 40,000 fighting men. So another point about Napoleon is he wasn't a modest man. But the thing that makes historians pause about Napoleon today is that there was an astonishing loss of life associated with all of his battles won or lost during the Napoleonic Wars. Millions died, both civilians and soldiers. And that has given historians pause as to what is the true legacy of this brilliant soldier. On the other hand, his civil legacy is very clear. He took France's moribund constitution and shook it and sorted out France's administration from top to bottom. He introduced the Bank of France. He started the lycée system in France. And probably the most important thing was that he introduced the Napoleonic Code, which is a justice system still in use in France today and in other countries around the world. And when he was writing his memoirs on the island of St. Helena, he said that he thought that his greatest legacy would be his civil code. And it turns out to be that is the case. There's no question on that in terms of his legacy. But there's this fierce debate between two sides. One, the brilliant soldier, but relentless battler whose men were lost and civilians lost in their millions during the Napoleonic Wars. And then this civil organizer who changed the face of France as we know it today. And those debates are going to go on as long as there is a debate about Napoleon in the world. So that's the Napoleon hero to some, tyrant to others, but a force of change in the French world. Here's one from Helen Moore in Casper, Wyoming, and it's about de Gaulle, General de Gaulle. She writes, de Gaulle's name is everywhere. That's true, Helen. And she asks, how is he viewed today? Well, Helen, you're right. You land at Charles de Gaulle Airport, you traverse through Charles de Gaulle Étoile in Paris in the metro. There are Charles de Gaulle monuments all across France. Many more Charles de Gaulle monuments in France than there are monuments to Napoleon, interestingly enough. And the town of his death, where he's buried, which is called Colombe les deux églises is now something of a pilgrimage point for people today in France. So clearly, Charles de Gaulle is a hero in France in a lot of ways. But I think there's three things that we can say about Charles de Gaulle. First of all, he irritated everybody. And without a doubt, that was one of his most annoying characteristics. Secondly, he is responsible for pulling France out of the ruins of the Second World War, not without thanks, of course, to Britain and America, to whom he was hostile throughout his life. But he put France back on the map in the 1960s. And the third thing is that he somehow managed to communicate directly with the common man in France, and his language and his way of communication has gone down in legend in France. Going back to that first characteristic about annoying people, I'd like to get a quotation. This is it's a tombstone, no question. 1.5 kilos on de Gaulle by Julian Jackson. It just came out in 2018, and it's considered to be the last word in Charles de Gaulle biographies. And here on page 701 is a reference to him from Winston Churchill. And Winston Churchill was asked, do you regard General de Gaulle as a great man? And Churchill paused and asked, do I regard him as a great man? He is selfish, he is arrogant, and he believes that he is the center of the world. So yes, he is a great man. And here Churchill very cleverly puts his finger on that paradox, which is Churchill, which is de Gaulle today. And I've got another quote from this book. I always go to the index in a book like this because how else do you can't start at the beginning and plow all the way through. But on page 876, there is a whole section on de Gaulle's personal characteristics from A to U. A for arrogance and U for unsentimentality. And we've got arrogance, austerity, authoritarianism, coldness, hubris, imperiousness, intransigence, mood swings, and self-belief, and then unsentimentality. So this was a man who generated all sorts of emotions about himself in the people that he worked with. And his so he annoyed people, but he turned France around in the post-war years, and we have to remember that he negotiated France through that difficult colonial history of Algeria. And then the final point is his ability to communicate. As in preparing for this lecture, I went back to watch some of his old TV broadcasts from the 1960s, black and white films, and they are astonishing. He talks in this elaborate French language, but he doesn't talk down to you. And the French absolutely loved it. There they were, sitting in their new sitting rooms, in their new built houses, with their newly acquired TV, all thanks, as they saw it, to General de Gaulle, listening to this man who communicated what he called a certain sense of France. He believed that France was destined to be great, and what happened to it in the 20th century was going to be repaired. And when he came back to France after the Second World War, that's exactly what he did. He built France. The Trente Glorieuses, which we mentioned in the lecture, was a tremendous period of optimism, which de Gaulle gets thanks for even today. So he communicated really well with the common man. And like many great leaders, he also spent a lot of time building his own myth, which is strong and alive today. Gaullism goes beyond politics. It's essentially right-wing politics, but you can't really, it transcends that, because Gaullism is a way of thinking about France. And this year, 2020, is the 50th anniversary of his death. So watch this space for all sorts of references to Charles de Gaulle's legacy of Gaullism. President Macron had a go just last week and got into a little bit of trouble by trying to associate some of Macron's achievements to Gaullism and his sense of France today. Politicians touch Gaullism with care, because it's a cherished notion for the French people even today. So that was Helen Moore from Casper, Wyoming. Thank you, Helen. Oh, here's another one on de Gaulle. Yeah, this is a very interesting question. Fascinating. Why was de Gaulle hostile to the UK and the US? He has everything to be grateful for. He went to the UK in the 1940s after the fall of Paris, and he established himself at the BBC, sending his voice across the airwaves. But he maintained this prickly attitude with de Gaulle and with FDR, and he never was grateful to either Britain or to America for the tremendous sacrifices that both of these countries made to the saving of France in the Second World War. And when he got back to France, he continued this anti-British, anti-American sentiment. Scholars then have scoured history to figure out what it was that motivated him in this way. And they've pinned it down to a resentment, a slow-burning resentment that he felt to something that happened in the end of the 19th century. And that was the big play between Britain and France for colonial power in Africa. And Britain beat France in control of the Upper Nile, and de Gaulle somehow fixed this in his mind and became resentful of that, and is said to have resented that to his deathbed. In the 1960s, he said no to Britain joining the EEC, much to everybody's consternation, including other members of the EEC who were ready by this stage for Britain to come in. And he said that he wouldn't allow it. His veto would be over his, he was not going to allow it to happen, because he saw Britain to be in the pocket of America. And if Britain joined the EEC, the community would become a big Atlantic alliance dominated by America. And he went to his deathbed saying that, and it wasn't until after he died that Britain was finally allowed into the EU as we know it today. So a long-burning hostility to everything Anglo-Saxon during his life. And thank you for that question, Eddie in Louisville. Here's one from Jim Friedlich in Mitchell, South Dakota. And he asks, where should we go to see the best Belle Epoque art? Paris, yes, Paris, and it's going to have to be the Musée d'Orsay, which is in a converted Belle Epoque building itself, a beautiful building, an old train station was converted in the 1980s into, I think, one of France's finest museums, and it houses the world's biggest collection of Belle Epoque art. I mean, Monet, Manet, Van Gogh, Seurat. Everybody's there, but the paintings are housed in this beautiful light-filled space, and you don't feel, as some of us do, I do, overwhelmed as you do sometimes at the Louvre. It's a delightful place to wander around and see all the best that is in Belle Epoque art in a beautiful Belle Epoque building. And while you're there, Jim, I would recommend you take some time to, there's a great restaurant, and it's a beautiful Belle Epoque environment, gold paintings everywhere, and you can eat a fine lunch. It's not cheap, but it is the most amazing place to eat lunch surrounded by art, drinking in and eating in the Belle Epoque period of France. So Musée d'Orsay, find an afternoon and build it into your schedule. So that's Jim Friedlich from South Dakota. And here's one from Judy Francis in Hatherop in the United Kingdom. And she asks, what happened to French leadership in gastronomy? Well, the French would say that they've never lost that leadership, but it is true, Judy, that France's leadership in the gastronomy is under intense competition from the rest of the world today. France considered itself the home of gastronomy. The word gastronomy is French, gastronome, and the Michelin star system is from France, but there are more three-star Michelin restaurants in Tokyo than there are in Paris. So word is out that it's not just France for fine dining. Plus, that whole notion of the kind of hushed cathedral of food, of dining that comes with three Michelin stars is kind of falling a little bit out of favor. And in my mind, France's leadership in gastronomy has never failed, but it has changed. And today's leadership is found in the local bistro, humble place where you go to for a lunch, where you know that the chef has bought the ingredients that are being served for your well-priced lunch in the market that morning, and he's cooked them that day, or she's cooked them that day. And that is an experience that cannot be beaten in France. Bistros are everywhere, and there's now a symbol that is put outside the bistro that says fait maison, fait maison, made by hand, made at home. And the chefs put that if everything is homemade. So you look for that symbol, and you're guaranteed an experience to beat all French experiences, which is a cheap, lovely lunch cooked from fresh ingredients in a place that is no nonsense, no fussy Michelin stars. And that, for me, is France's leadership in local terroir for the 21st century. So thank you, Judy, for that question. Laura in Long Beach, California, writes, what do the French think of the British Queen? Well, they love her, absolutely love her. Interestingly, the recent speech that the Queen gave in April of this last year on a Sunday was broadcast live on 3 major networks in France, and I can't remember, like 3 or 4 million people tuned in live on a Sunday afternoon to watch the British Queen. She's revered. She's like everybody's favorite granny for us and for the French too. And I always love the story that there was a protocol issue sometime in recent years when the Queen came on a state visit, and it turned out that she wasn't going to fit in the presidential car, Citroën, with her hat. So consternation on the French part, but they came up with a new Renault people carrier, which they altered so that it had high windows, so the Queen could sit in her traditional bolt upright stance, waving to the crowds. So a protocol disaster was avoided. So she's well loved. I'd say that the same doesn't go for the rest of her family, but that's another story. Thank you, Laura, for that question. There was a question that I saw earlier. I want to see if I can find it again, because it was last. Yes, Alan Goodman in Garnet Valley, and somebody else, and I'm sorry I've lost your question, but it was the same one, asked, what's the evolution of the French language? Why is it so musical? And I wrote some notes for that last week. So thank you for asking that question again today. And French is a Romance language, just like Italian and Spanish. So it comes from Latin roots. That compares with English and German and Dutch, which come from Germanic roots. And the two languages have certain differences in terms of the way things are expressed and the use of double vowels and double vowels. So France comes out as more musical because of this double vowel approach. And here's an example. That's terrible in English. Das ist fürchterlich in German. Quelle horreur in French. So you can see the sort of the musical sound of the French language, like the Italians too, much more musical to our ears than the Germanic-based English languages. So thank you, Alan, for asking that question. And I'm conscious of the fact that I should be now thinking about the end. And so I'd like to go to Kathy's question from Durango, Colorado, from last week, which I promised to address at the end of this lecture. And the question was, why do the French seem to always be on strike? And it's true. All of you who have come in and out on Viking know that we all suffer strikes on SNCF and Air France coming in and out of the country. And there's a different attitude to strikes in France than there is in other countries. And you have to ask yourself why. Here we've got a country that seemingly has everything. Great food and wine, we talked about before, but free healthcare, free universities, a great social security system from cradle to grave. You can retire at the age of 62. What is there to strike about? And yet, you're right, Kathy, people always seem to be on strike. And I thought of an example from my own time in France. And I was going once to work on the tram, and the tram ground to a halt, and we all had to get off because there were strikers on the track. So I had a grumblingly walk to work, and on the way, I stopped and asked the strikers what they were striking about. And it turned out that these were 16-year-olds. It was a lovely day and they'd cut school, so that might have had something to do with it. But they told me that they were on strike in solidarity, and that's the key word, solidarity, with people who were about to retire at the age of 62. So teenagers in solidarity with their grandparents in essence. And that notion of solidarity, we should add to the notions of liberty, equality, and fraternity that we talked about last week. You don't complain about strikes in France. In fact, there has been a train strike every year for the last 72 years. How about that? And once I remember complaining to a colleague about not being able to get to Paris, and I was lectured by, no, don't complain. You should show solidarity to our brothers and sisters of the SNCF who are striking for change. Because in France, the only way to really get change, engineered social change, is through strikes. And it's different from other parts of Europe where negotiations and consultations happen and then strikes are the the end of the process. In France, people still take to the barricades very quickly. And I'd like to finish by asking James, if you're still awake, to put up an image which I thought summed up this notion of France and its propensity to strike. So on your screens now, you should have a big image of a massive sculpture that was put up in Brussels in the EU to celebrate the revolving presidency, which was going to the Czech Republic in 2009. And the government asked a Czech artist whose name was David Cerny to build a structure celebrating Europe, which he did. And on that structure, there are various little vignettes of different countries. And James, if you go to the next slide, you'll see that one of those vignettes was Italy, Subutio, football, soccer, nothing wrong with that. That's pretty harmless. And then the next slide, James, is Lego, and that is Denmark. Again, seems pretty uncontroversial. But it's the next slide, James, please, that got everybody up in arms in France, because there was the map of France, the hexagon, with the word grève, which means on strike, written across it. And the French were horrified, and there were debates at the highest level as to what is France's image in the wider world. And there was a big national debate on France's image. And I thought I'd finish with a quotation that comes from that debate by a philosopher called Sylvain Tesson, who wrote, "France is a paradise inhabited by people who think that they're in hell." And there it is, that paradox. Only in France can we be in paradise and in hell in the same place. And the French propensity to strike is part of that paradox. And in the spirit of only in France, I've got a thing from this week's newspaper, which I thought I'd finish with. And it's, I guess my headline here is, "Fear not, everybody. France will continue to astonish us," because it recounts the story of a bored worker in France who sued his company because he didn't have enough to do, and he won. And the company was forced by the government to pay him 50,000 euros for being bored at work. And I think that could only ever happen in France. And with that, I'd like to bring to an end my 2 lectures on France. And I hope that you've enjoyed our voyage since the very beginning of France through to the 21st century. I have a very big reading list to give you this week, and it'll probably take me a little bit of time to put it together, so it won't be finished by tomorrow. But one of the books which I swear by is this one, France, a Brief History. It's written by Cecil Jenkins, and it's 2011, so it's quite recent, but it's a thematic history of France, and it doesn't plug through the ages year by year, and it's fascinating about the development of France. And in the narrative, Jenkins shows why the French have begun to see themselves as so different, and that comes out in that book. So I highly recommend that one. And then you can't go wrong with A.J. Liebling, Between Meals, a love affair with French food, a beautiful book which makes you want to jump on the next plane and come to France, as does this one, Julia Child, and I'm sure many of you would have read it, but in our sort of semi-lockdown phase, it's lovely to have a project, and sometimes dreaming about a country that you're going to visit is part of that. And Julia Child, an American in France, can't be beaten. But the book that I'm reading at the moment to put myself to sleep is by Marcel Pagnol, and it's called My Father's Glory and My Mother's Castle. And this book, it's a children's story about a French child growing up in Provence at the turn of the century. And you can just hear the cicadas in the background, and you can smell the rosemary and the thyme. It's a complete love affair with France and an innocence of childhood in France. And it's a lovely way to go to sleep, which I'm reading at the moment. And one last thing, and this really is my last thing, is a recommendation from an American colleague of mine who is saying that they are riveted by a French series called Un Village Français. It's a long-running French TV series, and it's available on Amazon Prime. I haven't seen it, but it comes highly recommended, and it's on PBS quite often. And it's an intimate and sometimes scary look at life in a French village during the German occupation. It's got absolutely rave reviews, and it's been going on now, repeat, for the last few years. So catch it if you can, but don't flinch when you get to some rather serious discussions of things like the deportation of the Jews, which the series confronts head on, something that is almost taboo, was taboo in France for many years. A couple of warnings: it's in French, but it comes with English subtitles. So one of my friends said it's a great way to practice your French while you look at the English subtitles. So I'll put together a really good, thorough reading list for you to accompany this review of France. And with that, I'd like to say thank you for being with me over these 2 sessions. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. So all that remains to say is au revoir et bonsoir from Winchester in the United Kingdom.